take my notes. You'll have to give the talk.
I think that these are all mine.
I think that's it, yeah.
Okay.
Good morning. So it's been my experience. I sent out a plea this week. I said, my mind is just a blank. Could somebody else pick the music? That was beautiful. I know you heard it last week, but I didn't. That was beautiful. It's been my experience that when someone else picks the music, it always goes perfectly with what I'm talking about that day. So I may be doing that more, Lynn. So today we begin a new emphasis in our 12 power study. This month we look at the spiritual power of will. Matthew 5:37 says, "Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no." That's pretty darn clear. Your power of will is your yes and your no. It moves all the other 12 powers into action, and its highest expression is not what we call willpower, which pushes and forces an idea in or action, but rather willingness. You know, willpower has always been kind of like a negative thing to me. And I'll tell you why. Because from my teen years into like my 30s, I dealt with an eating disorder. And everybody would always tell you, you just have to have willpower. And it's like, you know what? That doesn't work. That's just saying, I'm just going to do this, because I noticed that every other thing in my life that I set my mind to, I did. But that one thing, no matter how hard I pushed, pulled, no matter how many crazy diets I went on, no matter what I did, I could not lick that until I got to the spiritual problem of it. So it's not about willpower and pushing and forcing something to happen. It's about willingness, a willingness to connect with spirit and grow as a spiritual being. Will is the power of commitment, which is at the beginning of every successful endeavor. And we talk a lot about free will, but just how free is it? Does it cost us anything? In Eric Butterworth's book, The Creative Life, he talks about the creative process, specifically the creation story as we're told in Genesis. And on the fourth day of the creation story, God said, "Let there be two great lights." God was referring to the sun and the moon. And Butterworth says, metaphysically, the sun stands for the spiritual power of understanding, which we talked about a couple of months ago. Understanding is the ability. Hello, God is calling, you guys. I like the ringtone. You're welcome.
Do it again. Call me back.
Okay, so understanding is the ability to gain direct perceptions of truth from the divine. And it lets us comprehend spiritual knowledge. Then he says in the creation story that the moon stands for the spiritual power of will. Just as the moon is the reflection of the sun, will is a reflection of understanding. And it leads the way to the spiritual process of co-creation with God of our lives. It's with spiritual will that we find the key to creative living. And this, Butterworth says, is what we call the flow of life. It's about centering or learning to live from center or from within out. It's about practicing the presence of God. And when we talk about the presence of God, that leads me to talk about Brother Lawrence. Are you familiar with Brother Lawrence? Brother Lawrence had a lot to say about practicing the presence of God. He was a monk in the 1600s in France who was assigned to the monastery kitchen, something he wasn't really thrilled about. It's a place where he did the tedious chores of cooking and cleaning. And it was there that he developed his rule of spirituality and work. Brother Lawrence went to a place in his heart where the love of God made every detail of his life of the highest value. He said, I love this. He said, I began to live as if there were no one save God and me in the world. Think about that. Together, God and Brother Lawrence cooked meals, ran errands, scrubbed pots, and endured the scorn of the world. He learned to practice the presence of God throughout the day, and he used his spiritual will to create a life of close communion with the divine. And here are some ways Brother Lawrence suggested practicing the presence of God. First, begin each day aware of God. When you first wake up in the morning, focus on God. Meditate on something that will put you in a state of worship. Butterworth suggests that before your feet even hit the floor, do something that connects you to God. An affirmation or a short prayer is all you need to make that connection. Next, read something spiritual. If you ask God for spiritual insight from a spiritual reading in the morning, like the Daily Word, or any kind of reading from Scripture or any kind of spiritual book, you'll be able to apply your spiritual thoughts and beliefs throughout the day in your daily activities. It's kind of like your little stone process that you created. Anything that you start the day with is always there for you to draw upon for the rest of the day. Next, he said, pray. Another way to practice presence is to dedicate yourself to God's service at the beginning of the day through prayer. Then talk to God throughout the day, as Brother Lawrence did. Don't wait for formal times to pray. You can talk to God ongoing. You never have to stop. Next, let gratitude be a habit. Practice gratitude in every situation. You'll be surprised at how much you have to be grateful for. When you let God direct your day and look for the blessings in your life, living in gratitude will lead to real joy. Next, learn to be silent. In this hectic world, it helps to remember the words of Psalm 46. Be still and know that I am God. Silence was highly valued by the founders of the Unity movement. So much that they called their prayer ministry Silent Unity. God speaks to the quiet and attentive heart. So make time throughout your day to be still and quiet. And finally, at the close of the day, rest in God's presence. Thank God for how you were guided all day and connect one last time before you go to sleep. I guarantee that if you practice even one of these each day, or a couple, or a few, your perspective and then your life will change. Butterworth calls our attention to one bit of caution, and it's about our prayers. He said that many prayers use the force of will, or that willpower kind of thing, rather than the willingness of spiritual process. He says that There's a willful insistence of the human ego that it knows what's right and best all the time. We generally, this has been my observation, wake up in the morning thinking we know, that we are right. Right? I mean, really, what's the point of getting up if you don't think you're right most of the time? But this willful insistence of the human ego that thinks it knows best and which drives many of our prayers for what we want rather than seeking through divine guidance and what is the best for us, it causes us to sometimes push for things which we've decided are exactly, precisely, to every single detail what we want, and it eliminates all those things that may be best for us and others, and it limits us by being so specific. We exclude all the wonderful things that God has in mind that we haven't even thought of. And that's why Butterworth's "let there be" or "let it be" becomes so important. And that's why we pray this or something better, because we don't know what's possible out there, what wonderful thing is in store for us. I've shared with you that how before my confrontation with the semi-truck in 2006, I had the free will to do that job that paid an incredible amount of money to do something that was totally unfulfilling. But when I had time to stop and look at my life, I realized there are consequences to free will decisions. Just like the prodigal son who found himself wallowing with the pigs, we sometimes create a life we hadn't intended by not practicing the presence of God and just stepping into divine flow. With regard to spiritual will, it's not "there will be" or "God make it be." Again, it's let it be. There's no force, no pushing, stress, or anxiety to the idea of letting the divine flow take its course and just jumping in to the flow. It's a way to reframe our desires and to get right relationship with God. So there are some things to remember about practicing presence, which first, it helps if you live intentionally. Sometimes a simple affirmation like, "God, this day is from you and for you," or "I will live this day in gratitude," sets the tone for the whole day. Another thing to remember when it comes to will and willingness is that complaining just eats up your time. Rather than focusing on what's wrong with the situation, find something in it to be grateful for and move into the next spiritual step rather than dwelling on what's wrong. I've caught myself many times being incredibly whiny. I just hate it when I realize I'm doing that. And when I do, I have a deal with myself that I stop and think of 3 things I'm grateful for. And it has amazing results. The first thing you know, you're looking for things to be grateful for. And of course they show up because what we focus on, expands. We've established that this willingness leads to the practice of the presence of God. But what about God's will? Are we required to submit to God's will when it goes against our own? Butterworth says, listen to this, that God's will is the ceaseless longing of the Creator to perfect himself in that which he has created. In other words, it's God's desire to perfect himself in and through us. You are a co-creator with God. God can only will the full expression of your capacity and power. So in the best sense of your core essence, God's will and your will are the same. Many people believe, and you may be one of them, that it's our duty as human beings to discover God's will in our lives and then to surrender to that. We hear that all the time. But usually the belief is that God wants something for us that we don't want for ourselves. But Ellen Davenport says in the 5 Principles, what if that's backwards? What if, because we are spiritual beings having a human experience, we've come to earth with divinely inspired intentions and purposes? We show up that way. What if these desires spring up as reminders of why we're here, or as signals of where we're to go next? Davenport says that desire gets a bad rap. She says that desire is what makes us move and want more. It's what improves our life and what improves the world. Emily Cady wrote in her foundational unity book over 100 years ago, she said, remember this, desire in the heart for anything is God's sure promise sent beforehand to indicate that it is yours already in the limitless realm of supply. And whatever you want, you can have for the taking. You might want to be careful with that. Whatever we desire is already headed our way. Katie's saying that our will is God's will, and that it bubbles up from the divine spark within us. If we're one with God, how could our true wills be separate and different? The closer we move to God, the more God is in our lives, the clearer it is that our will and God's will are the same. And Ellen Davenport says one more important thing about this, and that is in answer to the question, how can we tell we're on the right track, in alignment with God and good? And the answer is, it feels good. It feels right. And God can only use you to the extent that you're willing, rather than willful. Willingness is the key to spiritual awakening. The real key to waking up, to be awake today, the real key to waking up is wanting to wake up. You may already think you're willing. That's why you meditate, read spiritual books, talk to your friends about enlightenment, go to church and retreats and all that good stuff. But close your eyes for just a minute. Look inside for a moment. Focus on this idea of truly awakening and see how you feel about this subject of willingness. Can you feel any resistance at all? Can you feel how much you don't really want to wake up? Something inside you knows this awakening thing is going to be different, really, really different. And maybe you're frightened about the something inside. Maybe you're frightened about that, and the something inside wants to feel better about life, but it doesn't really want to do all the work that this entails. Why not? Because the something you're awakening from is the something that is resisting. It's the something that isn't willing to awaken. The resistance you're feeling, the unwillingness, is simply the energy of ego. It's the ego resisting what's its eventual demise, or what it believes is its demise. After all, the whole job of the ego is to preserve itself. Well, maybe demise is too harsh a word. Let's just say that the ego gets to go from being the dominant player in your life to second on the totem pole. So there's a massive resistance that's human and normal to awakening. This is part of the cost of will, of being willing to awaken and practice the presence of God. It's the movement of ego from first place in your life. The natural question at this point is, well, what do I do about that? Well, it's a very good question, but the question itself is just more resistance, and it's more about the ego trying to stay in control. So going beyond this resistance, becoming more willing, is the simplest. Now notice I didn't say the easiest, I said the simplest of things. It is just let it be. Let it be. Let it. Let it. Let there be two great lights, understanding and willingness. What and who you are, the I am of you at your core, wants this awakening to happen. The I am is awake and is looking for the awakeness to transform everything in your life. So simply pause and let there be understanding and willingness. Allow is the word. I think you'll find this mindset of allowing the flow of God to be a better one. It's far more in alignment with what is really happening in your life in the flow of the divine anyway. And with the divine flow comes the presence of God. Cooperate with it and you'll find your willingness and your spiritual will increase. Then when will leads to practicing presence, that can lead to something else, and that is commitment. Commitment is made up of some very important aspects. We never begin anything without commitment. And these aspects of commitment tend to be what give our life quality. Commitment is about connection. It connects our values, intentions, and actions. Passion is the essence of commitment. It's motivated from within. And passion is the seed from which it comes. Without passion, our commitment lacks meaning. Next is that commitment equals persistence. It drives us during challenging times and helps us to maintain integrity. Commitment requires insight and self-awareness. If you find yourself being conscientious and productive, but you are still not happy, then you may be lacking some self-awareness and insight. It's difficult to be committed if you're not certain about what's important to you. Commitment requires your ability to observe yourself and make conscious, awake decisions. Next, commitment is purposeful. Though we sometimes lose perspective, commitment is not haphazard or random, but rather it always involves choice and intention. Commitment is self-expression. It's the expression of who you really are. It's the ultimate expression of our true values, and it's wonderfully fulfilling. Commitment and vision are inextricably tied together. Expanding your vision while developing your commitment produces powerful results. Commitment inspires us to be and do our best, and to communicate with integrity and clarity. And finally, commitment is surrender. It's giving ourselves to what we most believe in and want. All of this commitment starts with will. You have to be willing to commit. It's the agreement you make with yourself to let your actions match your intentions, and that is the most important commitment of all, and the one that actually impacts your life, and it takes spiritual will to do this. In the book Finding Yourself in Transition by Robert Bennett, he says, a true commitment is not an obligation to something or someone outside of yourself, but rather is a commitment to yourself. An agreement that you will give up some freedom in some parts of your life in order to enrich other parts. And in the long run, generate even more freedom. So, this can be another cost of so-called free will. Once you make that commitment, you may have to give up something else. But when you have committed to something in alignment with your values and beliefs, and something that reflects your true passion and makes your life better, isn't it worth it? My friend Reverend Jimmy Scott likes to quote an old saying, "Take what you will and pay for it." So maybe free will isn't so free after all. But regardless, we should cherish our spiritual power of will because it gets us where we're going and it helps us create the life we really want. Thank you. So now